In this world, there are a few things I love. I love salmon, I love nuclear physics, and I love the power grid. The power grid is, by some metrics, the largest, most complicated single machine in the entire world. Billions of interconnected parts requiring perfect balance. Among every single way we have to generate electricity, the largest, biggest power generating single site in the entire country is the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington state on the Columbia River. I am frequently in awe when I think of the Grand Coulee Dam in eastern Washington. It's 550 feet tall, 5,223 feet long, it's like a mile wide, and it produces 6,809 megawatts of electricity, which is enough to power huge portions of the Pacific Northwest. And even when we're all running our ACs during a heat wave or whatever, we still export electricity. That's not exclusively off the back of the Grand Coulee Dam, but of all of the dams in our area, the Grand Coulee is certainly the largest. In the entire life cycle of the Grand Coulee Dam, it's expected to cost, including its construction and running it and everything, I'm adjusting for inflation, blah, 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 like $8 to $10 billion. However, what if I told you on the Columbia River, there was a federal site that dwarfs that amount of money completely? It generates no power, and most people have never even heard of it. This place I'm talking about is the single largest cleanup effort in the entire world that's ever happened. And if this cleanup project was to fail, radiological disasters beyond our comprehension could occur that would end the Pacific Northwest as we know it. If you have heard of it, you certainly know that I'm talking about the Hanford site, a radiological ghost from our past that continues to haunt us here in the Pacific Northwest. The Hanford site is part nuclear waste dump, part previous nuclear production facility for weapons-grade plutonium and uranium, and part disaster. But what if our definition of a disaster is completely backwards? What if Hanford is just a potential crisis, while Grand Coulee is a realized, fully completed, biological apocalypse that we have comfortably normalized? I certainly would never want to minimize the problems of the Hanford site. There absolutely has been roughly 65 to 70 square miles of groundwater contamination, and the wildlife and soil of the area has certainly been affected. However, in my opinion, compared to the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hanford site's present ecological damage is nothing in comparison to the Grand Coulee Dam. Is hydroelectric power renewable? Yeah, technically, the water goes down, the gravity pulls the water down and the turbine spins. And then my AC comes on. It's great. But I think in order to understand the scale that is the disaster of the Grand Coulee Dam, you have to understand how a dam works a little bit. Basically, you have like a river, right? And then you stop it. Really, really advanced science here, I know. But when you do that, you create a big body of water called a reservoir. Although a reservoir ends up where a river used to be, it is vastly, vastly different from how that river once operated. It's difficult and kind of abstract to consider, but before the dam and after, right behind the face, the water level is now 357 feet higher. A once highly mobile, sediment-rich, beautiful river became a much, much deeper, slower-moving, and therefore warmer lake. Relative to natural speeds, overnight, this entire ecosystem went from being a forest with a river running through it to completely submerged in water. There was never any fish ladder built in the Grand Coulee Dam. It's too big. So the 1,400 miles of the upstream river is now completely cut off from the rest of the river for any wildlife in the water. There are so many other instances of profound loss in the wildlife within the Theodore Roosevelt Reservoir. But for me, one of the most haunting examples of why the Grand Coulee Dam was an absolutely apocalyptic disaster for the area is that Kettle Falls, an incredible fishing and gathering place for centuries, was buried under hundreds of feet of water. The amount of historical and cultural loss suffered by the Confederated tribes of the Colville Reservation in this area is immense. For the people who lived along the upper Columbia River, particularly regional and Native American tribes, the completion of the dam in 1942 was a permanent, devastating disaster of green energy. I could talk more about flooded graves, the extinction of June hogs, and the downstream compound effect that has damaged waters and wildlife even hundreds of miles away, but I won't. Instead, I would like to posit a hypothetical to you. You've seen Star Trek: The Next Generation. I certainly have. I'm a big fan. Who's better known in our entire media landscape for handling moral dilemma than the one and the only Jean-Luc Picard? You gotta love him. Now, first, I have to lay some ground rules because there's this pesky thing called the Prime Directive within Star Trek, I gotta get rid of it. So, in my hypothetical scenario, I am going to gift both humanity and Chinook salmon with warp travel. That basically makes them individuals in the eyes of the Federation of Planets and thus deserving of rights despite the Prime Directive. Additionally, my Chinook salmon will also be telepathic and are able to communicate with Jean-Luc from outside of our planet, with their brains. That way everything's fair. I'm going to have Jean-Luc warp into low Earth orbit, and he's going to discover us here with the Grand Coulee Dam generating electricity and irreparably damaging and killing untold amounts of Chinook salmon in a way that will eventually cause them extinction. You see, if the Chinook salmon could talk, if they could telepathically communicate with the crew of the Enterprise, they would be sending out an SOS signal. They would be saying, look at what has happened to us. Look at the complete exploitation and destruction of our habitat and our people for the sake of human convenience. They would express the apocalyptic conditions they face because of a massive infrastructure project like the Grand Coulee Dam. Picard would then turn to us for negotiation. Do I need an air conditioner? Do I need a 71-year-long lifespan? Do I need the modern convenience of the surplus power generation of the Grand Coulee Dam? No, I can live without it. We as a species can live without it, right? Right? The Chinook, king, sockeye, salmon of the Columbia River, they can't live without the Columbia River. They are dying en masse and have since the 1940s, let alone native populations and the June hogs and everything else I talked about. They cannot live without the Columbia River. What entitles us to caging it behind 1 million, billion, trillion gallons of concrete so that I can turn on my AC? Picard would, of course, have unlimited futuristic tech. You can replace the dam with fusion reactors tomorrow and save the entire river, right? It's an easy moral choice. But you and I do not have incredible futuristic sci-fi technology. If you tore down the dam today to free the salmon and undo all of this atrocity, the grid would drop 680,000 megawatts. Our deeply interconnected society would fail, and fossil fuel backup plants would spin up instantly to keep our lights on. To save our river's ecosystem and to look at the planet as a whole through a lens of sustainability is incredibly difficult. Andreas Malm has an excellent book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and it talks kind of directly about these themes. If an infrastructure asset is actively committing ongoing violence against the biosphere, is destroying it a moral imperative? If we refused to spin down the turbines of the Grand Coulee Dam, if we refused Picard's orders to live sustainably with our Earth and continue to cause damage, would Jean-Luc Picard have a moral obligation to use force, to blow it up? Do you and I have a moral obligation in this way? The complex truth in reality is that we're already here. You can't just blow up the concrete. Doing so would unleash secondary catastrophic waves of toxic reservoir sediments, obliterating human life on an even grander scale, and it would be truly horrible. How lucky we are that Chinook salmon are not telepathic. How lucky we are that the potential nuclear disaster of Hanford is the ecological disaster story of my state. How convenient it is that Hanford is the ecological disaster story of Washington State. And that is the ultimate reality of the situation, I think. We love a cartoon villain. We love to look at Hanford's 54 million gallons of buried radioactive sludge and feel a clean, righteous sort of terror. It's easy to look at a ticking ecological clock and point a finger at the obvious monster. But Hanford is a disaster that might happen. The Grand Coulee Dam and a million other places are disasters that already have happened. We built a massive 600-foot wall of mid-century concrete, slapped a smile on it, and called it green progress, and completely normalized the biological apocalypse. We permanently erased over 1,100 miles of ancient, pristine salmon-spawning habitat. We drowned cattle falls. We systemically wiped out entire tribal ecosystems and ancient ways of life, and we wrapped it all up in the pristine, sterile bow of a monthly utility bill. So what exactly am I even saying? Is humanity supposed to accept mass rationing, freezing winters, and deaths in the heat? No, I don't think so. But I think we owe it to ourselves to at least be honest and look in the mirror and know that when we plug something into the wall, no matter how green, no matter how energy efficient, when we participate in our beautiful, interconnected society with our incredibly complex machines like the power grid, there's harm. Irreparable, serious harm. And vigilance. Vigilance, Mr. Worf. That is the price we must continually pay. Learning from our mistakes and living sustainably with our world, I think that's the takeaway. I think it's easy for us to tell ourselves that something like hydroelectricity comes to us with very little cost because it's not coal and it's not producing greenhouse gases. But there is villainy, an invisible, insidious villainy in our comfortable infrastructure and our daily lives. This video you're watching, the server that is hosting it, the device in your hand, the modern digital civilization we take for granted, it is actively subsidized by a completed apocalypse. And to disconnect yourself and not be aware of that and think of that means that we are doomed to repeat the mistakes we've already made. Arm yourself with knowledge and do what you think is right. I hope you appreciated my video. It's a little bit of a downer, a little bit of a freaking downer, but I would say if you want to do any reading on it, you should definitely read How to Build a Pipeline. That's a great book. I probably am bleeping that because I don't think you can just be saying how to build a pipeline. Additionally, Tara Justine has an excellent article on the Spokane Historical about the ceremony of tears, which was basically when the water started rising, a bunch of tribe representatives, a bunch of people from all sorts of walks of life came to the reservoir and basically said goodbye to centuries of horror. It's so sad. It's so freaking sad. You should go read her article. Go read the article by Tara Justine on the Spokane Historical. Taught me a lot. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.